So hi everyone, and welcome to today's Wildcard Wednesday, where we are going to get in gear for the Canadian ELD mandate. Thanks for joining us today. We have a really great turnout. My name is Sue Miller, and I'm a Senior Fleet Account Manager here at Geotab and your host for today's expert session. So getting us in gear today for the Canadian ELD mandate is Kyle Dodsworth, Solutions Engineering Team Lead, who is the subject matter expert on all things ELD. So Kyle, take it away.
Thanks so much, Susan, and thanks everyone for joining us today. So yeah, we're going to get in gear for the Canadian ELD mandate. We know there's a lot of questions about Canada in terms of just their hours of service in general and ELD mandate that's coming down the pipeline in the summertime. Full disclosure, we are located in Toronto, Canada, so this is something that we've been following quite closely. So we are quite well versed and well situated for Canada ELD, and it's not as hard or scary as you might think. So let's first talk about a quick agenda. We'll go into a background, a little bit about Canadian hours of service and the timelines around the ELD mandate. Then we're going to dive right into the actual regulations. And when we do that, we're going to do it in two different parts. One, we're going to talk about the actual ELD part in Canada, but we're also going to talk a lot about the Canadian hours of service as well. Now, we're doing that because they are really tightly linked together. Unlike in the USA, the two are actually really, really close together, and actually they're going to live together inside of the ELD because it's a requirement. It's not a requirement to do something like that in the USA. So that's why we're going to talk a lot about the Canadian hours of service rules too. We'll also talk about the differences between the two ELD mandates, as well as the similarities. And the reason why I say that the Canadian ELD mandate isn't as scary or overwhelming as you might think is because there's actually a lot more similarities between the two countries than there are differences. Then we'll talk a little bit about choosing the right ELD partner. And then we've also got a slide for lots of informational resources if you want to really learn a ton about different examples of hours of service, or if you want to read through all of the material that Transport Canada released, that's all linked there at the end for you as well. So that's the general idea. First things first, though, the background and timelines about Canada hours of service. So Transport Canada is the equivalent to the Fmcsa in /DOT in Canada. So they're responsible for the Motor Vehicle Transport Act, and we've had that here for about 4 decades. Now that led to the creation of the Commercial Vehicle Drivers Hours of Service Regulations, or the CVD-HSR, as some people remember it, but the actual law itself is SOR 2005-313, SOR 313-2005. It's used interchangeably. Most people remember it as that in terms of the law. Now, the primary goal for the hours of service law, just like in the USA, is to minimize driver fatigue and increase safety. So Canada's hours of service comes directly from that particular law. And the Canadian federal mandate for ELD has been issued but not implemented. So talking about that a little bit more, Transport Canada released some numbers to talk about the Canadian market, and they found that there's about 150,000 commercial vehicles in Canada that will need an ELD. But because the USA had their ELD mandate and 2 years earlier, about half of those already will have some type of ELD because they go into the US during their regular business. On top of that, we're probably looking at somewhere in the neighborhood of 50,000 more vehicles on the road in the next 5 to 7 years. So there is still quite a lot of a market considering how much smaller Canada is compared to the US, but there's still a pretty good market considering the size of Canada in terms of commercial vehicles that will require an ELD. Now, the timeline specifically to the ELD mandate in Canada, December 16th in 2017 was when the first announcement was made. It was actually made about 3 blocks away from my house, which was kind of cool. And it was published in Canada Gazette Part 1. That's sort of like the Federal Register in Canada. Now, if you fast forward about a year and a half later, in June of 2019, then we had the final announcement by Transport Canada in Canada Gazette Part 2 that actually really flushed out the details around ELDs, and that was what triggered the actual countdown. So part of that countdown was originally a 2-year countdown as to when you needed to have an ELD. So that would be June 12th of 2021. However, just last month in March, at the beginning of the month, the transport minister from the Canadian government announced that there would be a progressive enforcement period for fleets when it came to the ELD mandate. Which basically means it's going to be a soft enforcement period, so there won't be any fines as of that June 2021 date, and you have more time to actually get an ELD. And we'll talk about that a little bit more a little bit later. So those are the timelines, and as you can see, it's kind of close to the way that the US rolled out their ELDs. The big difference is there isn't any period here where you can use an AOBRD in Canada. Like in the US, you had a grandfathering period. That doesn't exist inside of the Canadian rules. Now, the goal of the Canadian ELD mandate pretty much the same as the US. So the biggest one is obviously safety and fatigue. We know that 25% of the convictions for drivers are due to running over the hours of service limits, and drivers with hours of service limit violations are more than twice as likely to have an accident. So again, we're focusing on safety. We've also got an efficiency play here as well, because the electronic world, it does save time and money compared to the older ERD systems or paper. There's also a competition piece too, so that everybody follows the regulations. It's a lot easier to make sure that everybody is following the same set of rules when it's electronic. And also harmonization, similar to what we see in the USA, is we're trying to align the provinces and the federal rules as much as possible. So those are the main goals, and those, as I said, will be very similar to what you would see when the Fmcsa first rolled out the ELD mandate in the US way back in 2016. Let's talk about the actual regulations. And like I said, we're going to talk about the hours of service regulations and the ELD regulations kind of separately so that we get a really good idea of the two. And the reason is because they are really tightly linked. The first thing, though, is we want to talk about the current electronic device criteria right now. So as of right now, if you've got drivers driving around in Canada and you want to use an electronic device, you absolutely can. So the current federal mandate, that's that SOR 313, it allows you to use an electronic recording device as long as it captures driving time and the total on-duty time and the cycle that you're using. It lets you change your duty status and obviously logs where and when you did those. And it also logs when the device was disconnected and reconnected. Those are really the only 4 things that you need for an electronic device right now. And that's actually been the law for quite a while. And so if you have a device and you're using it right now, maybe it could be upgraded into an ELD. That might happen. That's what's going to happen with our devices. Our devices at Geotab right now, they count as an electronic recording device, and they'll just automatically become an ELD. If your current device isn't planning on becoming an ELD, then you would need to start shopping for something new, and hopefully you've got something in mind already. But you can still use electronic. But you can also still use paper right now as well in Canada. So what is an ELD? I'm pretty sure everyone here would know the answer to this one already, but just to cover it, ELD is an electronic logging device that's used by drivers of commercial vehicles to automatically record driving time and their hours of service. It also captures data from the vehicle's engine, like movement and miles and hours, that type of thing. Keeps everybody informed. You've got real-time information, helps with compliance and inspections and planning. The biggest thing to keep in mind is ELDs are made up of lots of different parts. You've got the vehicle piece that plugs into the actual vehicle. You've usually got fleet management software and a driver interface so that the driver can actually interact with it. And you've got lots of different styles and different technologies that can all be in play. Now, specific to the Canadian ELDs, you can have lots of different styles as long as they meet the technical standards for Canadian ELDs and are certified by an accredited third-party certification body. And that's one of the biggest changes that we're going to talk about between the US and Canada. A US ELD has to obviously meet the technical standard for a US ELD, but it can be self-certified by the manufacturer. So that's a big difference, and we're going to talk about that quite a bit later on. Who needs to follow Canada ELD? Well, it's pretty similar to the US. If you're a driver of a commercial motor vehicle and you operate across provincial lines or into different countries or states, and that particular truck and trailer combination is more than 9,921 pounds or 4,500 kilograms for us Canadians, you would need to have an ELD. So it's very similar to the standard idea from the US mandate. The big difference, though, is that there isn't a paper backup option in that 8-day and a rolling 30 like you see in the US mandate. Any driver in the US can just flip and use papers as long as it's less than 8 days in a rolling 30. That does not exist inside of the Canadian mandate. But exemptions do. So there are exemptions as well. If you are a driver, you can be exempt from using an ELD if you operate under a specific permit that's been issued or have a statutory exemption. Statutory exemptions are basically built into legislation and laws. One big difference between the US and Canada is baked into this exemption is that if you are using a rental vehicle and the term is less than 30 days, you're also exempt from Canada ELD. So this is nice that the Canadians bake this right in, so we don't have to worry about exemptions or expirations and things like that. But you do have to make sure that the rental agreement is less than 30 days, and you can't stack them. So you can't, if you're going to rent something for 6 months, you can't do 6 30-day periods. They have to be finite and ending in those 30-day periods. And also, just like in the US, any vehicle that's manufactured before 2000, same exemption applies because we can't get the engine data that we need from something that's older than 2000 reliably enough, so it's carved out as well. So if you have one of these exemptions, you can go and use that electronic recording device that you have, or even paper, because you don't need an ELD, but obviously you still need hours of service. Talking now and switching gears a little bit into the hours of service piece in Canada. Now, hours of service in Canada, it is like the US. You have the same style of numbers and you're calculating things in the same way, but there's just a lot more calculations that have to happen. And we have lots of information. There's lots of information from Transport Canada and from the Ccmta, which is the Canadian Council of Motor Transport in Canada, to help you understand all of these different numbers. I don't anticipate everybody being experts in hours of service from just watching a webinar like this, but we wanted to get an idea of all of the different things that hours of service in Canada is tracking, because the ELD has to do this as well. So I talked about that earlier. Part of the ELD mandate in Canada is that it has to be able to tell your driver when they're running out of hours, and also has to be able to tell your driver what hours they're running out of. So unlike in the US, where none of that is required, although I will say most ELDs in the US do support that feature, it's not a requirement. Basically, if things aren't 100% correct with a quote unquote rule set or the rules that an ELD has baked in, there isn't anything that the Fmcsa would necessarily worry about, because they don't anticipate that ELDs in the US would do those numbers. But in Canada, they have to. In fact, going back to that idea of that certification by a third party, there are specific tests in that certification process that the ELD has to pass concerning calculating these things and doing the math correctly. So that's why we want to talk about it a little bit here, is because when you go into a Canadian ELD, it's going to start doing these calculations automatically, and they're going to be right because they've been tested by a third party accreditation body. So there are lots of different styles of hours of service in Canada. You've got different rules for different areas of the country. There are exemptions for things like oil and gas. We're going to talk about just the basic Canada south of 60 cycle. So that's going to cover most of Canada and most regular drivers. In Canada, the first thing that we want to talk about is the concept of a workday. Canada has this concept of a workday, which is a 24-hour period, and in that 24-hour period, you have a bunch of numbers that you have to make sure you keep track of. Now, that 24-hour period can start at any point in time that the carrier might want. Most drivers who are sleeping at night and driving during the day probably going to have a start of day at midnight. But you've got other drivers who might actually do the complete opposite. Maybe they sleep during the day and they drive at night. So you could also have a start of day that is noon instead. All that does is tell the system that this is the 24-hour period that we're going to look for a workday. Now, they also have the exact same concept of a work shift like we see in the US hours of service rules, where when your driver starts driving, he has to have at least 8 hours off. So that's similar to the US where it's a 10. In Canada, it's an 8. In that period, they can only drive for 13 hours. So that 13 hours is in a work shift and in a work day. So that is more than what you can see from the US hours of service. But you can also only drive in a 14-hour on-duty period. And all of that has to be wrapped up in a 16-hour work shift. So you can see how all these numbers start to work together. You've got a 16-hour work shift and 8 hours off, and you've got a 14-hour on-duty time, and all of that is baked around a 13 hours of driving time. Again, there's lots more information available, but we just want to show you how all of these numbers are being calculated inside of the ELD. So on top of that, you also have to make sure that you take 10 hours off in that 24-hour period. And in order to count for these 10 hours off, it has to be in at least 30-minute blocks. So Canada doesn't really have a break type of warning like you would see in the US, but you do have to make sure that you've got at least 10 hours off spread around in this 24-hour period, or that is what's called an off-duty violation. And that type of violation is completely unique to Canada, where you can actually get a violation for not even driving. All of the other types of violations that you're usually used to are for driving. Now, there's also cycles as well. So when you're driving around south of 60 in Canada, you can do a 70-hour, 7-day cycle, or you can do a 120-hour, 14-day cycle. Most people do the 70 version because obviously if you do 70 twice, you get 140, which is way more than 120, but you do have those different options. But no matter which option you choose in your cycle, you have to actually have 24 hours off every 14 days. So you can't just keep rolling constantly. You got to have a little bit of time off. And you can also reset your cycles in Canada as well with 36 hours off if you're on the 70-hour version, or 72 hours off if you're on the bigger version. So that's another difference. There's an extra 2 hours compared to the US. So some drivers get tripped up on that. When they come up to Canada, they forget to take the extra 2 hours. You can also do split sleeping as well. So those 10 hours off that you have to take can be split into 2 parts. And to make it extra more complicated, there's a thing called off-duty deferral in Canada where you can take up to 2 hours of those 10 hours that you have to have off and move them into the next day instead. So you could take only 8 and then you can do 12 the next day. Now, the reason I have all of this on this particular screen here is because all of this is what is actually tested inside of the Canadian certification process. So you have to have off-duty deferral in there because there's a specific test for that. You have to make sure that you do the different cycles because there's tests for that. It's a lot more work for an ELD to do all of this reliably compared to the US ELDs, which don't have to do it. They might, but they don't have to do it, and they certainly don't have to do it good enough to pass a third-party certification. You've also got adverse weather available in Canada as well. It works a little differently, but allows you to take 2 hours of that 10 hours off that you needed, convert it over into driving if you need to. Personal conveyance exists in Canada as well. Big difference though is unlike the new definition in the United States where you can still be laden, you can still have cargo. In Canada, you have to be unladen and you can only use 75 kilometers a day. So again, unlike the US, they've capped it at a hard 75, something that some people want the US to do and they haven't yet, but Canada's done that already. 75 kilometers a day is the maximum. Now, I mentioned there's also different rules. So if you're above 60, so north of 60, which is the 60th parallel that separates Canada from the provinces to the Arctic and the territories, there's a completely different set of rules if you're operating in the north because you get a lot more flexibility. We're not going to cover it here, but again, more information can be found in the actual law, the SOR 313/2005. So what might a graph look like in Canada versus the US? And again, tons of examples are available from the Ccmta. This is just an example of what you might see from a standard or kind of normal day for a driver. So normal day, his work day starts and ends at midnight in this case, so 0 to 24. So that's the 24-hour period, and we know we've got a bunch of numbers that we have to keep track in our heads here. He starts his day at 2 in the morning, and that's when his work shift opens. So at that point, 16 hours later, he can't do any more driving. Within that 16 hours, he can work for 14 hours. And within that, he can drive for 13 hours. That's exactly what we see here on the graph. Everything here lines up perfectly, and there's no violations at all. So he does his pre-trip in the morning at 2 a.m., takes about an hour, maybe breakfast, then drives for 9 hours. That's kind of unique because in the US, if you drive for 9 hours, you'd have to take a break somewhere before that 8th hour. There's a difference between Canada and the US right there. Then he takes 2 hours off for lunch and then drives for another 4 hours. And at that point, he's at his 16 hour for the end of the day, has to go and take off duty again. So if we look at the numbers, he didn't break any of the rules. He's got 16 hours of consecutive for his work shift. He's got 13 hours of driving and only 14 hours on duty. Because those are also within that 24-hour period, no breaking of rules there. And he's also got the 10 hours off because he's got 2 hours at the beginning of the day, 6 hours on the end, and then that 2-hour break in the middle. And all of those periods are greater than 30 minutes. So no violations anywhere. This driver is exactly what we'd like to see. He could do this for 7 days until he runs out of cycle and has to do that 24 hours off. Then he can just do it all over again without any kind of issues at all. So the graphs do look the same. Like I said, they're the exact same 4 statuses, but keep in mind, behind the scenes inside of that Canadian ELD, it's doing about 9 or 10 calculations and showing you the availability based on how all of those mesh together. So lots of things that the ELD has to do. Some questions that we get a lot about Canada ELD and hours of service. So the first one is, if I have an ELD from the US that's on the Fmcsa list, can I just use that in Canada? And the answer is maybe, because that ELD would have to get certified in Canada as well as being on the Fmcsa list. So I'm sure a lot of those ELDs will be going through the certification process, but you'll have to make sure that they appear on both lists. Now that start of day piece, we also get a lot of questions about that start of day. That start of day is really just the time where the driver is resetting his work shift. That's the best way to think of it. So if the driver is going to be sleeping over midnight and then starting in the early part of the day, best to have that start of day while he's doing that midnight sleeping. If it's the inverse, best to have that start of day moved over and make it line up to where he's taking that big 8-hour block for rest. It just makes the calculations a little bit easier, and it makes the availability look a little bit more normal. Now, one thing on that though, is that not every ELD is going to be able to support changing that start of day for you. Now, it is a requirement of the Canadian ELD mandate, but it's not one that's going to be enforced until 2023. So some ELDs may allow you to change that start of day to a different point in time, and others may not when they first start rolling out. In Geotab's case, we do support starting whenever you want, so midnight, 6 a.m., noon, whatever number makes sense for you. But it's not something that every ELD is going to do right out of the gate unless they've chosen to tackle that particular requirement early. So what time should my start of day be? It's really up to you. It makes the most sense to be that time when the driver is doing that big rest, but you can pick any number. Best thing to do is to actually look at when they're going to be driving, when they're going to be resting, and pick a number there. What should you do if you start the day in the US and then you go to Canada? We get this a lot, and this is actually something that's answered by an Fmcsa FAQ, is you have to make sure you plan for the countries that you're going to be going into. So if you start the day in the USA and go to Canada, you're probably not going to have any kind of problem when you go and change and start adjudicating yourself on the Canadian rules, because the Canadian rules are generally more flexible than the US. The one thing to keep in mind there, though, is that if you are taking lots of little off-duty periods that aren't 30 minutes, those aren't going to count towards that 10-hour requirement in Canada. So you might want to think about that. If you're going the opposite way and you're in Canada and you're going to the US, then you have to start thinking about how the US rules are a little bit more restrictive than Canadian, especially when it comes to that start of day. In Canada, you start your day with 8 hours off and you're good to go. In the US, you got to start your day with 10 hours off. So if you're going to be in Canada and going to the US, it's best to do 10 hours off, even though you don't need to in Canada, because when you get to the border and if you get stopped in North Dakota, they're going to obviously adjudicate you based off of the federal rules for the US, not the federal rules for Canada that you just came from. We also get questions about how the Canada ELD mandate changes the Canadian hours of service laws, and they actually don't at all. So there's nothing specific in the ELD mandate that changes the way that Canada hours of service works right now. And then the last question we get a lot is, do I need an ELD? And that's a question that unfortunately we are not able to answer because every scenario is a little bit different. So depending where you run, what you carry, how far you normally drive, there's lots of things that go into that particular question. Chances are, if you're currently logging hours of service now, you would probably need to keep logging hours of service in an ELD for this mandate. But the best thing to do is reach out to the enforcement partner in your particular area and give that scenario directly to them, and then they'd be able to help you with that particular question. Let's move on now in between US and Canada and talk about the differences between the ELD mandates themselves and the things that you might see a little bit different when you're in the USA versus Canada. So the first thing, the similarities. And I said there's way more of these than there are differences. In fact, if you were to go and look at the Canadian law and copy a snippet out of it, just a paragraph, and then look for that exact paragraph in the US law, you're probably going to find it. Like 90 to 95% of the Canadian law is lifted directly off of the USA law, like a direct copy and paste down to the bullet point numbering, the tables. And that was done on purpose so that there was a lot of harmony there and you didn't have to completely retrain people when they got into Canada. They wanted it to be as close as they could while still making sure that it met the Canadian laws. Now, automatic drive time, those automatic on logs, those are all the exact same. Unassigned driving logs, those are the exact same thing as well. The log edit and the workflow, including being able to not edit those driving logs when they're automatic, all that's the same. You got to sync with the engine and pull the exact same information out. Special driving statuses, they're there as well, so yard move and personal use. And a special shout out to Yard Move because it finally is now available in Canada. It actually didn't exist specifically in Canada until this ELD mandate. Most people could still use it and most officers wouldn't really worry about it, but it didn't actually have a text written down into the law until this particular mandate. So great to see that up here. The fact that it's model year 2000 plus only, all of that is the same. So the differences. Well, one difference we already talked about in that exemption piece. So the rental truck exemption, obviously that's different. Another big difference is drivers who pick up that unassigned driving time that was wrong can put it back if it was by accident. And that's actually really good because it's a lot less work for an admin to have to fix that, as well as it's going to be something that comes in handy, and I'll show it a little bit later, because the US allows this in an FAQ answer. So more on that later. The personal use piece, it does exist, but it does have to cap at 75 kilometers a day. So once your driver uses that 75th kilometer, they can't use that personal use again until the next day, and the ELD has to force that. On the yard move piece, it can only be used at 32 kilometers an hour or lower. So that's like 20 miles an hour or lower. If you go more than that, it's going to kick you off because it's going to assume that you're on a regular public road now. The bottom bullet point here is the one that I talked about a lot earlier, is the ELD must warn drivers when they're running out of work time. So that's why the ELD must support the hours of service regulations and their associated rules. Now, it doesn't have to do every single one of them because some rules are not required in the test steps. So like the oil exemptions, and there's a ferry exemption in Canada, those aren't likely going to be supported by most ELDs right off of the bat because they're not required in part of certification. But I believe most ELDs will add those in later, especially the oil piece. The ferry one, there's only a couple places in Canada that you can even use that ferry exemption. So that one may not be supported by a lot, but the oil one most likely would be an important one for most vendors to get to. Now, another big difference is the roadside transfer. So the roadside transfer in the US, it's all baked into this electronic system for records of duty status called eRODS that Fmcsa built, and you can use web services, and it basically sends everything electronically, and there's a special interface for officers to read it. That's not going to be the case in Canada. Canada's not going to build anything fancy like that. So it's just going to be purely an email address, and you type it in, and it sends over a package to that email address that's going to be a PDF file of the logs and a CSV file as well. So that's going to be like you're at the side of the road, officer gives you his email address, you email it over to the officer, they then open it up and can read the data package. Big point though is Canada did make sure by law that that data package is going to be encrypted, and only the enforcement partners will be able to view the files. And this is because there is personal private information inside of that file. Things like where you've been, where you spent the night, your driver's license. So they knew that they didn't want that to just be a regular PDF that anybody could be, copying and sending around. So that data package is going to be encrypted, so you can rest assured that it's not just going to be something that you can open by anybody. Also, malfunctions work a little bit differently in Canada as well. You don't have to switch to paper when you have a malfunction in Canada. You can actually keep using that device as long as it's still an interface and you can still use it. You just have to keep a log of the malfunctions for 6 months as a carrier. Now, hopefully most ELD systems would have like a reporting tool that allows you to do that 6 months automatically perhaps, but is a little bit different than the US when it comes to malfunctions. And lastly, again, I think I've said it probably 4 or 5 times, the ELDs in Canada will not be self-certified, but rather they'll be accredited by an actual accreditation body. So Transport Canada is the one who will accredit that particular company and say, yep, you are going to be able to certify ELDs, so go out and certify ELDs for us, thanks. So frequently asked questions about the ELDs in Canada and the US. The biggest one that we get as an ELD vendor is, will Geotab be certified? And the answer is yes. It's something that as soon as we had the announcement in 2017, we were on board. Yep, we will definitely be certified. We have letters guaranteeing that for our customers that we put out. Our blog, we can follow along the process on our blog about our certification partners. So we will definitely be certified. That's definitely not going to be a problem for us. Now, will other vendors be certified? We don't know. Again, we're focused on our certification. We are friendly, obviously, with lots of other vendors, and obviously more will be certified, but we don't know which ones. The chances of all of the ELDs that are on the US list appearing on the Canadian list are probably slim. There is quite a lot of effort to build the features required for Canada ELD, and there's obviously a cost working through the certification as well. So not everybody's going to do it, but hopefully the larger ELDs out there, and hopefully by now, any ELD that's planning on it is already working with the certification partner like we are and have guaranteed to their customers that they're going to get that certification, because it is crunch time. Now, the certification bodies, currently there is only one in Canada. Hopefully more will be coming down the pipeline. I'd assume they would have to be. And I should say too, this is an ongoing certification as well. You don't just get it and get it forever. You actually have to be tested every single year. You've got to do at least 25% of the testing every year ongoing. So there most likely will be more certification bodies that come on board, because as more ELDs get certified, we'll need more bodies to do those testing pieces. So I'm sure there'll be more coming down the pipeline. Well, between now and whenever we get an ELD, what do we do now? Well, you can log the exact same way that you did before. And that's because of that progressive enforcement period that was pushed out by Transport Canada, the Minister of Transport. Now, what exactly that means? Well, we don't have any more information than what the minister put out. So what we do know is that you won't get a ticket for not having an ELD on June 13th. That is for certain. We don't know, though, how long this progressive enforcement period might last. Now, we do have a lot of our associations in Canada providing guidance and asking for a specific number. 12 months is the number that's been kicking around, but we don't have an actual number from the government yet. If we look at what happened in the US did a 6-month soft enforcement period, so maybe that's what they'll choose to do. maybe we won't know until more companies get certified, because as of right now, there aren't any certified ELDs. We're all going through the process together, and maybe they're going to wait to see how many become available before deciding on what date might actually have this ending for this progressive period. But as of right now, everyone should be making sure that they're talking to vendors about this process, checking in on them, making sure that they are going through the process. And when they get certified, well, then we'll see what happens with Transport Canada. So some of the features that you might need for the mandate, what I'm going to do is talk about some of the features that will definitely have to be added into a US ELD to make it a Canadian ELD. And as we go through this, because Geotab's already finished all of this development work and it's actually already released, I have pictures and screenshots of the way it looks like in our system. But this is just representational of the fact that these are new things that would be added to a current ELD, or if it's an ELD that's just going to be in Canada, that's brand new, they'd have to have these features as well. But they could look differently. They obviously have freedom to choose how they want to implement some of these features. But the first one is that transfer mechanism. You've got to have a different transfer mechanism for Canada versus US. And that's because that package that's being sent over is completely different for the Canadian ELD mandate. As well as, unlike in the US, where you click the email button and it goes to the Fmcsa and it's a baked in email address, well, in Canada, you have to be able to type in an actual email address. So that's obviously different. Now, there are going to be ELDs that have an email logs option currently, and those are usually ELDs that used to be AOBRDs or have a feature that you can email logs to an email address for like record keeping purposes and things like that. That may not be sufficient for Canada because the Canadian requirement, it's a very specific PDF with specific sections that need to be in there. So check that. If you do already see an email button and you can email to any email address in an ELD, just make sure that it's actually going to have the information required for Canada. And also keep in mind, if you do use the email option that's the Canadian version and you send it to an officer in the US, they're not going to be able to open that file because they won't have that encryption key, because that encryption key is given to enforcement in Canada by whoever certified that particular ELD. So that's why we want to make sure you have different options. So you can see here on ours, we've got, this is the Canadian version, and then there's a link that you can say, oh, I'm actually not in Canada. Of course, this defaults when we detect that you're in Canada, we're going to give you the Canada version. And when we detect that you're in the US, we give you the US version. But make sure they're different because you don't want to mix them up, because then the officer is not going to be able to see or get the logs. Speaking about transfer, one kind of unique thing about Canada is that if there's any issues that the system detects before the transfer goes through, there's actually a little pop-up that has to come up and say, hey, I'm missing this information, or hey, I'm in a malfunction state. Do you still want to go and proceed with this transfer? It gives the option to back out and maybe use the display option instead. This is not the same as the US. In the US, we send it off, and if there's an issue, eRODS kicks it back to you, and you get the warning after the transfer happens, most cases for the US. So this is something it's a neat feature. It's going to save a bunch of time if there is any kind of issue, but it does have to prompt. It does have to have this prompt pop up, and it's a specific test step that the ELD in Canada has to do. Going on to those exemptions, so yard move and personal conveyance. So yard move works a little differently in Canada than the US. So if you are on yard move in Canada and you do an ignition cycle, so you turn your vehicle off at the dock and then you got to turn it back on to drive around to the other end of the building to the other dock, the system will actually ask you if you want to keep yard move on. In the US, it'll actually just turn off yard move automatically. There's no pop-up available, and there's actually no way to put that pop-up in there because it's not part of the ELD law in the US. For personal use, it does in the US, but not for yard move. So the Canadians basically just duplicated that little feature for this, which is kind of neat. And I've mentioned it already, it does kick you out of yard move when you hit 32 kilometers an hour. And again, the US has no speed requirement at all. So you can go on a regular public road by accident in yard move in most cases in US ELD. The PC use, it does have to hard code that 75 kilometer per day in there. And when you hit it, you have to have PC turned off until the next day. And that's a specific test as well. Remember, the US doesn't have any distance requirement at all. So this is something very unique to Canada. Moving on, another neat feature, and this is actually, I like this as a feature for everybody, but it's not a requirement in the US because the US doesn't have to do any of these calculations. But in Canada, since it does, when a driver changes into a new operating zone, so an operating zone is a property that's Canada only as well. It basically means if you're in the territories in northern Canada and you drive down into the regular part of Canada, and you change your rule set, it has to give you the new availability. And so we're calling it an availability preview. And you can kind of see it in action here on the right. Same thing would happen if you are going from the US to Canada or Canada to the US. It's got to give you a little snapshot of your availability so that you, well, two reasons. One, you pick the right one so that you're in the right rule set. And two, it has to actually give your consent to saying like, yes, like I understand that I'm making this change. And that part is what's part of the ELD mandate. You have to have that. In Canada, the logs, when you look at the location, will look very similar to the US standard. Before, the Canadian law was you have to put the actual address. So the ELD law usurps that and will have this combination of 4 kilometers south of X city. Another piece too about kind of distance and location is the total distance that you drive in Canada. That number doesn't include any PC time. In the US, it does. So if you were to look at a driver who was using, let's say they drove 1,000 kilometers in a day and 75 of it was in personal use, the total distance driven that day would be 925. In the US, it would still be 1,000 because there's no difference between PC versus regular driving in the US. So small difference, but one of those things that officers are probably going to look for. The last one, and this is another one of those features that I like, is that unassigned logs piece. So drivers in Canada can put back those logs if they mistakenly pick them up during that unassigned part of the workflow. Now, this is allowed in the US under that FAQ from the Fmcsa. So for us at Geotab, we've actually enabled it for all of our drivers because both US and Canada can use it. Different mechanisms to get that use in there because Canada baked it into the law, but the Fmcsa has a good FAQ answer on it. So we've allowed it for both. That's going to be an option for every ELD. Some may not, but we thought it was something that everybody would like, so we put it on both sides. Lastly, talking about choosing the right ELD partner, and I probably talked a lot about these already, but just wanted to make sure that you kind of talk about the 3 big pieces of an ELD. If you're still shopping around for an ELD, or if you have one that you don't like and you're looking for maybe a switch and this is kind of a convenient time to do it, just things to look out for when you're looking for an ELD partner. The first thing is commitment to continued compliance and ELD expertise on hand. It does take a considerable amount of time for an ELD provider to get everything right. It takes a lot of time to keep up to date too. Like the USA made a huge change to their hours of service with the final rule in September. Check to see if that ELD supports those. How was the rollout? Did they have to redo a whole bunch of things, or was it something that they were proactive about because that is something that could potentially happen again? Make sure that they are actually putting in the money of staying certified. Like the certification could be upwards of 6 figures in some cases for some companies. So are they going to put the money into the certification? Do they have a strong relationship with certification bodies? This one's a little hard to really know yet because there's only one and there's no one that's actually been through the full process yet. But how is that connection? Can you actually talk to the certification body about that process? Like, where are they located? Are they in the same country? For us, the certification body is actually in Montreal, so it's not too far from us. We can go and see them if we need to from our office in Quebec. Do they have compliance experts on hand? And what about their support? Are their support people pretty good with hours of service? I mean, not everyone's going to be an expert and not everyone's going to memorize every single piece of the rules, but does the support team have the tools to give you the answers when you have questions? Do they have a community or like a forum style where you can go and get help as well? That's another big piece. Everyone's in this together. We know every driver has the same kind of questions. Admins are all having the same kind of questions when they're moving into ELD. So is there a community where you can actually go and bounce ideas off of each other and get information? So you really want to pick a vendor who has a proven track record across the globe, especially where you're going to be driving. And we'll go through the process and commit to investing in making sure that you have a solution that's not only up to date and compliant, but also gives the fleet managers and drivers a better experience. That's a really big piece. It's a big change going from paper or even to ERD into ELD. So make sure you pick someone who can help with that experience, has the experience and knows the pain points that you're going to go through, and then has a solution for those particular pain points. So you really want to focus on improving the user experience for drivers and managers. So do you have things that are automated? Do you have a whole bunch of rules and exemptions already supported? That's going to make your life a lot easier. With Geotab, we have over 100 different rule sets that we support and probably 24 exemptions off the top of my head. Does it make the management piece easy? So is it easy for you to go and do unassigned logs? Is it easy to find violations? Is it easy to correct things if you have to? Are there reminders and alerts that go out? So do drivers proactively get information? Can you make custom ones so that if you've got something specific you need a driver to do when he gets into this area or that area, can you customize them? Do you have user-friendly features? Is it easier to get going? That's a big piece as well. The learning curve may be fairly steep depending on when you enable ELD. And again, we don't know when that hard deadline is going to be from this progressive enforcement period. So it might be quick. So picking someone who has those user-friendly features is going to be very useful in that case. We know it's time consuming, sometimes even frustrating to deal with ELD. With us, I mean, we leverage our ELD expertise to constantly innovate and improve both the telematics side of our business and the ELD product to make the process just as effortless as possible. The less time that you have to spend fixing things and the less time that your drivers have to spend fixing things and typing is more time on the road, and that's where you actually make the money. So we want to make sure that they're driving more, they're driving safe, and everybody is successful. The last one we want to talk about is the ecosystem of truck products that are beyond ELD. ELD is just one piece of a larger world that is now opening up for most truck companies. So we've got a platform ourselves that operates as the hub, and our marketplace can then be added in with different solutions for different truck fleets. So you've got things like dash cams, cold chain monitoring, asset tracking for things like flatbeds and containers and forklifts, those really expensive things that aren't actually trucks but are still really pricey. Fuel usage, mileage monitoring, fuel cards, engine fault reporting, so you can do proactive vehicle maintenance. For instance, like Geotab, we have a lot of big data experience, so we can actually detect when a battery might be failing and give you a warning, say, hey, based on our experience with this type of vehicle, when we see this happening with the battery, they usually fail in 6 months. We could give you that information up front. So that's something that is obviously going to be saving you a lot of time. Specifically for truck fleets, do you have integrations with current transportation management systems? So do we have those already existing with like the McLeods of the world and the TMWs of the world? Are those available already? And then things on the hardware side, like tire pressure monitoring, all of that stuff is going to just expand and make your life a lot easier in the long run. It might not be something that you're looking for right now, because maybe you're just focusing on ELD and getting that running because the government says you have to. That's great. But pick someone who, after you have that, gives you even more on top of that. Don't just stop there, because there's so much more that you can do. Having that open platform allows you to then plug and play different things depending on what your business requires, and you're not stuck having to go and buy from 16 different places and get 16 different invoices every single month. You can consolidate all into one place. So I mentioned as well, we have this at the end of this slide deck, which is just a list of different links. So if you want to go and read through Canada Gazette 1 or 2, if you want to go take a peek at the current regulations does have an amendment section, which has all of the new parts of the laws that will be added into their relevant areas in June. It's a little bit of a hard read right now because it's all truncated, but as of June, that link there will actually update and everything will be in one place and a nice read. The other part too is it's not as big as the US law. The US law is about 700 to 800 pages long. The Canadian one's about 40. So it's a little bit easier of a read if you do have anyone that you need to read it through. don't scare them. It's not a big one. The biggest link and the one that I use here a lot is the Ccmta guidance for Canada hours of service. So they have dozens upon dozens of different examples of hours of service, both done correctly and violations for all the different styles and different exemptions that are available. You can actually see it on a graph and understand it in a little bit more. So it's a good place to go if you've got a specific thing that you're wondering about. How does deferral work, or how does this adverse driving work? It's a really good place to look. And then at the bottom, you've got all of our blogs and content resources. And that's a really important piece, because if you want to follow along with Geotab's certification process with Canada ELD, our blog and our marketing team is the main point of contact. That's who it's going to push out all of that information as it becomes publicly available. We've already got quite a few blogs there that talk about it a bit. But as we get closer to that final announcement where we can say that we're certified, we'll publish as much as we can. And that's where the big announcement will be too, when our certification is done. Like I said, we're currently in certification right now with our certification partner. We plan and have always planned to have it done before the June deadline. The progressive enforcement period doesn't change that at all for us personally. We are still wanting to be certified before that date like we planned, and all points to that being a go. So hopefully we should have some more information within a few weeks. I think from there we could actually leave it open for questions, Sue.
That was a really great presentation, Kyle. Thank you for taking us through this highly informative session. Let's start off with, if a Canadian driver can't go on paper, do any provisions exist for drivers whose ELDs malfunction?
Well, yeah, that's sort of an interesting piece, is that if it, let's say your worst case, like it explodes or fries itself and you can't access it anymore, then paper is an option that you would be able to fall back to. The difference lies in the fact that with the US ELD, if there's any malfunction at all, you have to move to paper. In Canada, you don't have that requirement to absolutely go to paper. You can still use the ELD if it's still functioning in, and this is probably a judgment call by the driver and the carrier as to whether or not you want to keep using it or not. So there's more information in the actual law about that malfunction piece, but you would still be able to go to paper if it was completely unusable. That obviously is an option.
Okay. Where you stated yard move must disable at 32 kilometers per hour, is this disabled automatically in Geotab Drive if using a Canadian cycle, or do we have to define and enable the My Geotab rule for this to work?
Yeah, no, so that would be a baked in piece. So that rule, and I didn't comment on it at all. So there is what's called well, it's known in the industry as the UPS exemption, because they asked for it and it was granted by the Fmcsa to everybody, that allows you to keep yard move on during ignition cycles as long as you use a speed or a zone to turn it off. That is completely separate to the Canadian rule. So we're not going to rely on that to actually meet the compliance for the Canadian rule. We don't want to do that. What it will be is that if you're got a driver that's cross-border and the fleet goes back and forth, when they're in the US, that rule will work. When they're in Canada, it won't. So we're going to tie it to our rule set to make sure that when you're in Canada, it definitely does what it's supposed to for Canada. And when it's in the US, it'll do what it has to for US, unless you've turned on that rule and are using the exemption because it's an option. When you're on the Canadian side, it will just ignore that exemption and that rule entirely.
Okay. For the PC limit, is that day defined as midnight to midnight, or the day as specified by the carrier?
I believe it's the actual 24-hour period that you specify, because that would make the most sense. What's tricky is in the US, there's a midnight to midnight day that it's not referenced anywhere in any part of the hours of service rules, but it exists. So there's a bit of a confluence between those two, but it should be the day, like the 24-hour day that you set inside of the system. Again, that is a Geotab decision. It's not actually spelled out inside of the law as to what it should be, but considering the law considers a day to be starting whenever you say it's starting, that should be how it works.
Okay, and are all these features active in the current version of Geotab Drive so we can try them now? And if not, what version will have them?
So so 2101 is the version that's rolling out right now that has all of the screens that I just showed. Now, some things are still not turned on yet, like being able to transfer to enforcement. That's not actually going to work yet because we aren't certified yet. Therefore, the certification body hasn't been able to give the encryption key to any enforcement, so it wouldn't actually be worth it because nobody could open the file. So that still is turned off. You'd still want to use the display option, which is going back to the ERD rule is what you would do. And there's still a few tweaks behind the scenes that we're working on as well. But by and large, 90 to 95% of what needs to be there for Canada is in that 2101 release, and anything that's not will be there by the June deadline. Then we'll just have to tweak and patch back.
Well, that's it for the questions. And Kyle, I'll just say thanks again for getting us in gear. That's a wrap for today's Wildcard Wednesday, right on time. So until next time, I'm Sue Miller, and on behalf of myself and everyone here at Geotab, thank you for joining us on today's Wildcard Wednesday. We'll see you all next time, same Geotab time, same Geotab channel.